Everybody, and welcome to today's panel. Really excited to have our panelists with us today who are joining us from every corner of the globe, which is really exciting. Today, our panel will be discussing pivoting our contact centre strategy during times of disruption to remain CX champions shaping the business. What we're going to do today is rewind back to January 2020. If you had the gift of hindsight, what would have you done differently? Our virtual panel of contact centre heroes will open CCW Disrupt by discussing their 2020 journey, their challenges and the impact this caused for their organisation. Learn what they would have done differently had they been prepared for the same level of disruption COVID-19 caused, and why a strong CX continuity plan will be the bread and butter that holds our businesses together. My name's Tristan Fardy. I'm the former head of customer experience for Volkswagen Group Australia, and I have a fantastic group of panelists who will be starting with us today. We'll start off with some introductions, and I might ask Stacey to introduce herself to the group today.
Hi everyone, my name's Stacey Tomazoni. Thanks for having me today. Broadly speaking, Datacom, we're an IT and contact center services organisation, but at the heart of it, we're all about bringing people and technology together, really to create more meaningful and effective connections with customers. So we operate in the front line of many of government's essential services and increasingly in the commercial sector in outsourced arrangements. So more often than not, we operate under the radar as an extension to our customers. So hi everyone.
Great, thanks Stacey and welcome. Jerry, would you like to introduce yourself to the group?
Yes, hello everyone. My name is Jerry Campbell. I'm a director for customer service for United Healthcare. Just to rewind a little bit back to 2020, I'm in a new role now. I was formerly the customer experience manager for 7-Eleven. But for United Healthcare, we're delivering that customer satisfaction, ease, and effortless experience for our members seeking their healthcare needs. And just really drilling down to what interrupted their services and how we can effectively get the medical treatments as quickly and effortlessly as possible.
Lovely, thank you very much, Jerry. And Susie, welcome.
Hi, good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, everybody. I'm Susie Wong, based out of Singapore. I was the Chief Digital and Marketing Officer at Fuji Xerox for 2.5 years before I left last December. At Fuji Xerox, we believe that customer experience is everybody's responsibility, and it starts from brilliant basics to the magic moments, because we believe that there is no second chance to create a first impression. My remit at Fuji Xerox covered brand management, product management, customer experience, field marketing, and operations, and I'm really happy to be here to share our thoughts with you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Susie. And we also have Colin. Welcome.
Thank you. Yes, I'm Colin, and I'm the VP of Customer Experience at Freshly. We're based in the US, and we're a healthy prepared meal service. So we're kind of in a similar spot as other companies that are well known in the world, like HelloFresh as an example, which is very popular in the US and Europe. But we're not a meal kit service where we ship ingredients you use to cook meals, but rather we ship fully prepared meals, and they're fresh, not frozen, and they're shipped in these insulated boxes. And you just pop them in the microwave or in the oven if you so desire. So we kind of sit at the nexus of health and convenience. That's definitely been a very topical sort of thing in the age of the quarantine and so forth. But as a VP of Customer Experience, I'm responsible for customer support operations. So about 350 people across 5 locations we have currently servicing our customers.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Colin. I might ask our first question to yourself today. And what I'm going to ask you to do is think back to February and March 2020, so about this time last year. And if you can describe to us the way that COVID-19 initially disrupted and affected your contact center.
Yeah, I would say the main thing, I mean, interestingly enough for us, we were fortunate to the extent that some of the practices that we needed to have in place for COVID, we ended up embracing a little bit earlier. And that's partly because we are so dispersed across 5 office locations, and some of the people in our office locations already work remotely. So we are already facing some challenges in late 2019 about how do we kind of wed everyone together in a single culture. So we started to invest in culture more specifically, and we hired someone to be a community manager who would be responsible for culture and communications across the board, and champion different cultural projects, and so forth, and including using surveying tools and things of that nature to craft KPIs out of a culture to which we hold ourselves accountable. And I mention that because that was probably one of the biggest challenges on the COVID front, because we didn't experience so much downturn in the business because of the nature of us being a meal service. So we were on the less negative side of COVID to the extent that we saw an increase in demand for our meals as people were quarantining and trying to find a way where they could get meals and not have to cook every single night, but also very limited in being able to go out and go to the supermarket. So we didn't have so many challenges when it came to the number of customers, but we did experience challenges across our 5 offices, with every single person suddenly having to transition over about a week or 2 time frame, so very, very quickly, to remote work status. That includes people in the US and also includes people in South Africa and the Philippines. So people just across the board had to make a very quick transition. And in each case, it had its own technical challenges handling that, but also cultural challenges, where we had relied a lot on on-site culture, and had focused a lot on that, and now had to kind of recalibrate ourselves to make sure that people didn't feel too isolated in their individual spot. So if I had to do one thing differently, I just would have doubled down on the culture aspect of things sooner. But that was kind of the hardest thing. That was the hardest thing for us. We really tried to combat that by being much more mindful about culture, I would say, and also making sure we had better ways to track it. So I mentioned surveying systems as an example. So we launched weekly pulse surveys of our employees, and we expanded our culture budget to have local events and different games and contests and so forth. And we embraced a more robust incentive system where people could be recognized and incentivized for the work that they do. So a lot of different strategies to try to knit people together and hold leadership accountable.
Fantastic. How did COVID-19 impact your customers specifically? Did you see any changes in trends or customer behaviors?
Not so much behaviors, but we saw some spikes in different types of issues customers faced that were kind of interesting. So to give a very nuanced example, one challenge that we have is the delivery time frame for when our meals can be delivered, because they are fresh. So they have to be delivered after transit. They can only be in transit 48 hours or up to 48 hours. And we also have customers now who especially were dependent on our meals because they weren't going to the supermarket, and they were depending on our meals arriving at a certain time. So we saw an increase in issues with especially customers who are elderly and disabled, because the delivery carriers in the US, to protect their drivers from COVID, started to change the expectations that they had for their drivers. Whereas in the past, they would expect a driver to take this 14-pound box and bring it to your door. They no longer required that. So drivers could leave this big box in an anteroom someplace at the bottom of a long stairwell. And that created situations where, or even sometimes out in the street, that created situations where boxes could be stolen. Or if you were an elderly customer, you couldn't grab a 14-pound box and lug it up the stairs. So we had a huge spike in issues of people having difficulty just accessing their box. And we had to try to find creative ways around that. Some of it was on the manual front. So we created a program where we manually pack boxes for customers and reship them overnight if there's a failed delivery, knowing that now if there is a failed delivery, it's more significant for those customers because they're really depending on our meals, and also doubling down on certain customer support people of a senior status who could escalate issues with carriers and kind of put more pressure on them to get drivers to go back and deliver a box right to someone's door and things of that nature. So more things like that, less customer behavior, but very nuanced types of complaints we discovered that arose to impact the customer experience.
Okay, thank you very much, Colin. Susie, I might like to hear a little bit about how COVID-19 disrupted or affected the contact center at Fuji Xerox.
Yeah, so by way of context, right, for people who may not be as familiar with the Fuji Xerox business, we are in the document management services. So one of the areas that we focus on is digitization of workflows, right? So when COVID-19 happened in February, March last year, the way our call center is set up is that I run the Singapore marketing and operations aspect, but the call center is supported out of a regional center in Malaysia, right? So it's not just the rules and regulations that the Singapore government was instituting at that point in time, but we also had to contend with what the Malaysia government was doing. And they actually initiated what they described as the movement control order, all right, back in March. That was, in fact, 2 weeks before Singapore actually went into what we call a circuit breaker, which is, similar to a lockdown, I would say. So at that point in time, that basically, the call center that operated out of Malaysia had, all of a week to basically pack up the bags and say, you know what, in a week's time, you work 100% from home, right? Nobody could go to the office. So it was a bit of a scramble in terms of making sure that people had what they need and all that, right? From very basic stuff like VPN network access, right? To infrastructure, broadband support, depending on where they live, right? It was definitely very stressful times, right? And because of the restrictions from the governments on both ends in terms of us able to provide the service based on the team working in KL, and in Singapore, the government was saying that, you know what, only essential services can operate. The rest of you, work from home 100%. There's no workforce that can be in the field. So we had to navigate under very, very quick changing and dynamic set of circumstances, right? And, put out very quickly to our customers in terms of what we can do, what we are restricted by law that we could not. But I think one important thing was that, there's this saying, right? Everybody's in the same storm, but everybody's on different boats, right? So as much as possible, what we tried to do was, from a service provision point of view, we did the best that we could under the regulations and what have you, right? But what we tried to do was to manage the outcomes, the expectations of our customers, right? They may be used to certain things, but because everybody is sort of struggling to find the new, foot in the new setting, we made it very clear and communicate to our customers, this is, the service level that you should be expecting, or this is what we can do. And, please bear with us because we do expect a longer turnaround time because there are just not so many few engineers that are permitted in the field, right? So I think it's both sides in terms of both, I think of it as the supply and demand, right? The supply is as such what it is, try and manage and temper the expectations as it relates to the SLA from the customer's point of view, was how we sort of manage it during that time.
Great. And did you see any changes in trends when it came to customer behaviours?
I think like most economists at this point in time have described it, right? This is really a K-shaped, recovery. We have companies that are definitely facing the tailwinds of the pandemic, like in hospitality and travel, right? So we do see an increase, or we did see an increase in requests for waivers of contractual obligations, financial commitments, payment, timing of payment and stuff like that, which we try to accommodate to the best of our abilities, right? To be empathetic to these sectors that are specifically impacted, right? But even for the sectors that are being propelled by the tailwinds, right, that are doing well, we also noticed that there was a deferment in terms of the decisions that are being made, the bigger financial decisions, right? The projects, were deferred definitely as people sort of adopt a wait and see attitude and say, okay, how is the wind changing? What should we be doing, right? But in terms of I would say the smaller scale transactional type of investments, because as I said earlier, we are in the business of digitalizing workflows, right? And when the entire workforce, in the country is working from home, you need a digitalized workflow, right? So in that sense, we do have an edge in terms of driving the demand in that space.
Great, very, very interesting. Thank you, Susie. Stacey, I'd love to hear a little bit about Datacom and how the disruption of COVID-19 initially affected your contact centre.
Yeah, it was a real hurricane of activity and I would say emotion. We had clients desperately needing us to ramp up services as quickly as we could to support the nation's response to COVID. I can recall many conversations happening with clients at all hours of the day, weekends, whatever, as we really navigated what I would say was some pretty scary and untrodden paths together. The scale of which we were talking about was really, initially it was quite overwhelming, frankly. With various ups and downs over this last 12 months, we've hired and trained around 2,000 people, and it was in a very short time. In one case, over 1,000 people in less than 2 weeks. To do that, we leaned on our partners. We leaned on the wider Datacom group to help make some, I think, pretty extraordinary things happen. We built CRMs and virtual assistants over the course of a weekend. We rolled out a virtual desktop infrastructure and cloud telephony for over 1,000 people in less than a week. And then, of course, we stood by to field every imaginable question that you could think about with people with their bring your own devices or getting them up and running in that new technical environment. And while we played with the concept and we saw it as part of our strategy moving forward, I think COVID really unlocked the power of work from anywhere and that distributed workforce. One of my proudest moments across COVID was looking at a map of Australia and seeing all the dots right across the nation that represented all Datacom employees who were supporting those activities. And we had people in every state and every territory. And in doing that, what we saw was that we tapped into some really marvelous talent in areas that were hardest hit by COVID. And with many of those people still with us today, which is great. Then at the same time, we had the worry, and we still do, about the health and safety of our people. It was always at the top of our minds and continues to be, especially where in cases our people needed to continue fronting up to the office environment under the classification of being essential workers. I have a running list of, the great things that have come out of COVID, and no doubt we've all given it some thought. But one of the big things for me was that it's removed any barriers, perceived or otherwise, for communicating with our people. I remember filming this quick iPhone video on a Sunday night at home with my kids, feeling all sorts of knots in my stomach, but knowing that if I was going to ask people to front up to work the next day in the office, it was going to have to come from the heart. So I think that spontaneous connection with people in all sorts of ways has become far more of a reality. I think the authenticity factor has gone up a notch. No slide decks, just talking with people, and that feels more important than ever now. So in terms of how we handled it, for a while, there's nothing short of organised chaos. And people showed up, even though they were scared and they were uncertain, but they knew they were part of something bigger and that customers really needed them. And the really inspiring thing is that people, I think, rallied around that notion of what it means to be in service of their customers. And I think that's pretty special.
Absolutely. Brilliant. Great insights there. Thank you very much, Stacey. And Jerry, I'll also ask you to rewind back to February and March last year. Can you share a little bit about the disruption of COVID-19 and how that affected your contact center?
Yeah, I'd like to just, talk about the things that my panelists have already talked about, those disruption in culture, the disruption in the work at home environment. Like Susie, when I was at 7-Eleven at the time working their contact center, and our contact center was in El Salvador, and their government rules were shut down. They were shut down, and we had to really quickly pivot and go to that work at home model, working with the government, first of all, to be able to get the equipment to those agents working, and then creating a culture around our expectations of those members as they work from home. Not only that, but really we had to create that internal expectation and the external expectation upon what the customers were looking for. And the customers were really flexible as long as you were authentic and creating a expectation that they could realistically expect. And so that was the biggest hurdle we had to, was just being authentic with the customer and letting them know what we to expect from our service and our agents. And the culture to what Stacy said, you found out that these agents are really about customer service. They were wanting to come to work. They were ready to get into the building, but we knew that their health concerns were really would impact how we could deliver service as well. So we got in, gave them some cultural expectations, and got there up and running. And that's really the disruptive factors for our call center.
Fantastic. Great. Thank you very much, Jerry. Some really great insights from the panel. Thank you. I'll move on to our next question. And I might ask this one to you, Stacey, initially. And what I'd like to understand is, with COVID pressures, many organizations have accelerated a shift from voice to digital. And I know that you talked a little bit about some of the activities that you were doing. With growing interest in AI and automation, what advice do you have for organizations looking to automate parts of their business and the impact that it could have on the customer experience?
So I think, I mean, we already talked about this concept of unprecedented pressures on everybody's service delivery engines in terms of volumes, demand, complexity, that expectation of immediacy. And there's an inherent capacity issue here. And just trying to throw more people at it is just not going to be sustainable in the long term. So when I look at automation, I kind of frame it up as a set of another set of questions, if you like. Firstly, it's a question of urgency. And if I think about COVID, it was the accelerator of change, not the cause. How do we retain that gift of urgency? We've seen all of the momentum that we've built and what we've been able to do in very short spaces of time in the AI space, in the customer experience space, and how do we kind of keep that momentum going and boldly leap forward at pace. And if you haven't experimented in the AI space, it's, make a start. You get into that MVP and that sprint mode. You test, you learn, you improve. Know when not to automate and to create that seamless path to the human. And the second question is really to truly succeed here. I think that one of the biggest requirements is really that every organization puts the mirror up and says, what is my relationship, or what is our relationship with the word automation? Is it one that's going to serve you now and into the future? I reckon if you surveyed the workforce and you ask them to draw pictures around, describe automation in your own words, and I think that it would, it'd conjure up all sorts of images that depict the impersonal, the clinical, void of emotion and heart. And what I observe in the market is that those organizations that have solved for that problem, what they've done is they've really created this culture of co-design and inclusion, where employees actually feel like they're a necessary part of crafting the future. In fact, that the frontline actually realizes that every step towards automation is a step towards shifting them up the value chain so that they can actually get into the more complex, the more meaningful interactions. So they really embrace that mandate of being the number one advocates, if you like. Also, I think, how do you get more people to fall in love with the process, that the hard slog that is journey mapping, and to actually commit to that, to, getting actually emotionally affected by this sort of discovery process, and actually asking those questions of why do we do it that way. So yeah, there's so many different ways, and automation is just, if we can reframe how we do it, that it can be such a useful part of the way forward.
Fantastic, thank you for those insights. Susie, could you share a little bit about automation in your business and the impacts that it's having on customer experience?
Yeah, I think, when we talk about AI in the contact center, there are a few dimensions that come into play, right? We talk about customer journey mapping. We talk about the types of transactions. We talk about the customer's expectations in response. And I think that has been a lot of work, that many consulting firms have sort of plotted that into, a 3x3 matrix, and depending on what task and all that, one gives, right? But I kind of like to take a step back and sort of pan out, right? When we think about it, the reality today, right, that we see is that AI has got a huge potential, right, when it comes to simpler transactions and requests and all that. So when you think about it, if the AI engine is deployed to do that, then in terms of the human contact center reps, what we're looking at, the expectation is that they would be handling more complex tasks, right? And these would be tasks whereby our customers or the callers would be upset. The issues require different types of skills to solve, right? And that's when I think back to how the the life journey of the contact center in the CX sort of map, right? Is that when you think about it, the brand of the contact center has not evolved, has not caught up with the times, right? Because when we think about deploying AI at the contact center, then we're looking at broadly speaking, right, two sets of tasks, right? One set that can be handled by AI as it stands today based on technology and culture. And then the bigger question is, can our call center staff, right, how can they be equipped to handle the more complex tasks, right? And that, I think, has got to do with the whole talent shift and brand as it comes to the contact center. So I would say that, in organizations, as they invest in AI and all that, I think it's really important to look at the hand-in-hand approach in terms of how the contact center staff, from a talent and skills perspective, right, can actually evolve and complement the implementation of the AI at the contact centers.
Great, fantastic. Sounds like lots of realizations regarding the use of automation and AI, not just to improve the customer experience, but also how it helps us inside our businesses. How does it improve the employee experience? How does it help with user experience inside our businesses? So it's not just something that needs to be customer facing. It also really is something that we need to live and breathe inside of our businesses and be looking at its impact upon our people. Really great feedback. Thank you, Susie. Jerry, I might like to hear from yourself now just a little bit about growing interest in AI and automation and the impact that it's having in your contact center and your customers.
Yeah, so first of all, it does start with the process, and it does start with the employee themselves, that call center agent. We had a saying when we talked about automating or introducing technology is tech without any process is an automated mess, right? Because you have to get the involvement of those lower agents to understand what is going on. They have to feel that sense of need of technology. Then you have to break out those tasks, as Susie said, that automation can help complement, not complicate, the journey of not only the customer, but the employee. And so really digging down and finding out our processes, reimagining those processes and asking those questions of why, as Stacy said, is really the heart of the matter. And we were able to look at that as an organization, and then you can open up those other channels, right? And you can use automation to help you do self-servicing channels, or in a way that a chatbot or, just frequently asked questions can help eliminate and deflect some of the calls that you're receiving into your call center, and letting those call center agents, filling them, embracing that automation and those simpler tasks, and embracing the challenge of handling those more complicated tasks is really the crux of what organizations need. Again, a lot of people see this AI as a answer to their problems, but really it boils down to what processes are you using, and are those the correct processes? You need to figure that out before you start introducing any kind of AI technology into your organization.
Great, fantastic. Colin, what are your thoughts? Have you had a similar experience in your organization?
Yeah, we've been investing in AI and RPA, robotic process automation, since about mid-2018. And we started off with RPA a little bit more. So we worked with a company to create an automated bot that lives in our CRM that agents could trigger to go through the process of canceling customer orders, which involved about 40 clicks or so from beginning to end. So it allowed an automation of that process and was useful as our first foray into technology because it helped to get agent buy-in to technology. So it made it less scary for them because they weren't entirely taken out of the equation, because it's up to the agents to initiate the bot, and they would receive credit because of the decline in response times as a result, because that would accrue to their KPI. So it was a nice way to introduce agents and condition them to see technology as a friendly, helpful force, as opposed to a force that's going to replace them. For last year, we did double down on technology in a few different ways. On the customer-facing front, we did launch a more enhanced chatbot, which we had planned on launching prior to COVID, but ended up being especially useful as a result of COVID, because again, in our case, we saw a lot of customers coming into our service. And so trying to manage that additional volume in a way that wouldn't overwhelm us, and at the same time be conscious of costs, knowing that we had to funnel more and more of the costs on our business to securing our industrial kitchens, and because they had to stay operational and we needed people on the ground there. So the chatbot was definitely useful in being able to deflect otherwise easy to resolve contacts from chat primarily, which has been our major channel, about 50% of all our contacts. So that was very useful in helping to streamline those processes. On the agent-facing front, we also adopted more internal like agent assist AI technologies. Technologies that in real time assist agents with responding to customers, especially because we also did a lot of hiring in 2020, and wanted to make sure as we expand and we scale rapidly that the new agents that we're bringing on board have a certain consistency in the service they're offering customers, which becomes more of a challenge as you bifurcate and trifurcate and so forth, and you have people all over the place and they're not in an office setting, and they're not listening to their neighbor and how their neighbor interacts with customers. So having agent assist technologies that recommended real-time answers to customers and help to recommend phrasing and things of that nature without being too scripted, but help to guide agents more, help to ensure a higher level of consistency in service. Those are the two main areas that we invested in. And in both cases, they were very useful. But we're conscious about it and blended that also with doing a lot more research with our data team, because once you start to automate things, it also brings up questions about what you're automating, whether you should automate it, and what you could be losing from automating certain conversations that may be easy to automate because they involve a very basic question, like if you have someone who's not yet a customer, but they're going through the checkout process and they have basic questions about your business. Those may be very easy to automate, but you also could be losing an opportunity to give the customer an impression, a human-centric impression of your service early on, which can change how they look at you. So it could be easy to automate, but it may not be good to automate. So we kind of ended the year stepping back a bit and working more closely with our data team internally to map out different categories of conversation types and examine things like retention across customers who had certain types of conversations, and compare like the human approach with the bot approach, and try to identify areas where the bot shows a decline in retention figures. So trying to be a little bit more nuanced about what we automate so we can be more thoughtful about that this year.
Great. Okay, thank you very much. Stacey, gonna redirect the conversation now. I might ask you this one about offshoring and how you see offshore service delivery fitting into the new world.
It's been a really interesting turn of events, I'd say, with disruption to the supply chain. If I specifically focus on the Australian-New Zealand market, with India and Philippines really being challenged to continue service delivery at scale during COVID, where there were nationwide lockdowns, people couldn't come into the office. And this was good for us in a sense that it proved that we could do the work on shore. We had no choice, even if only in a BCP or as an interim, on a temporary basis. And this was all happening at a time where Australians had even more burning, more complex, sensitive and deeply emotive needs. So a local conversation was well received by all, especially when it meant that doing so, we were creating jobs onshore and helping our communities. So some large brands, they've publicly declared their commitment to bring jobs back on shore, and they're doing that at scale. Telstra and Westpac, for instance, are hiring locally as we speak today. But many others, I think, are left scratching their heads and thinking that, if I want that for my customers too, so if I've got most of my workload and interactions being delivered offshore, if I want that for my customers too, how on earth am I actually going to beat that labor arbitrage play? Even if I've been harboring thoughts about the questionable value and benefits of the offshore equation, I know that when I add it up, the numbers, they just don't add up, at least on a transactional and per unit basis. It's just unbeatable. So this is the part that I get pretty excited about, actually, when you think about what's possible when you're able to park for a moment this, I think, fairly common fixation with a race to the lowest. What's your lowest cost per FTE, if you like, and really lift the conversation to how do I make sure my entire workforce and even more importantly, workload is optimized and deliberate? That every connection that I'm having with customers is a meaningful one for everyone involved, dare I say it. And enter the hybrid workforce, so the best of human and digital workers, as our biggest chance, I think, in pulling this off and being able to deliver services on shore, where combined with some pretty ambitious service and experience design, like Jerry was talking about, we can get really, really focused on what's our true cost of service, the total cost, that end-to-end experience, and how we're using that optimum combination of human and AI to deliver maximum value. I think there's no doubt that there will always continue to be a place for offshore delivery. But I think COVID's invited us to rethink more deliberately what goes and what stays or comes back in a far more holistic and possibly discerning way.
Yeah, really interesting stuff. And I think the points that you made about some really big brands making decisions to reinvest, to come back onshore, really has been, I think, driven by COVID as the catalyst, but business is certainly stepping back and taking the time to really have a think about that value proposition and really thinking, what conversations or what touch points should be handled where. So yeah, really interesting changes happening there. I'll open the next question up for the group, and anyone feel free to jump in. Would like to hear a little bit about how you shift from a reactive to a proactive CX strategy to ensure that we're driving business value in times of disruption.
Let me take that.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, I think at Fuji Xerox, right, we believe that customer ownership is at the individual level, right? So, in all the interactions that we have with external parties, prospects, and customers, we seek to woo, win, and wow them, right? And we look at CX experience being decentralized, and the way we operationalize it, and which has worked for us and is working for us, is really in terms of having two types of configuration. One is what we would describe as the CX Council, right? So the council is made up of representatives from each department, and it meets once a month, right? And the meeting is chaired by the CEO, right? And the operating principle is upward delegation only. So if you can't attend, if you're representing your department, guess what? Your boss needs to be there, right? And in these meetings, these council meetings, is where we discuss about how we can improve and elevate the customer's journey. We look at what we sort of determine as the customer performance indicators, right? And when we think about it, it's not about what customer satisfaction is from an internal lens, but from an external lens, right? So as an example, finance may say that, oh, I want to improve billing accuracy, right? But what does it mean from a customer's lens? From a customer's lens, it means that I should not be receiving any credit notes, right, or debit notes and stuff like that, right? And then when we talk about, let's say, services rendered by our service engineers on the equipment in the field, right? Although we commit to a service response time, if you think about it from a customer perspective, it's not when you show up. If you say a 4 hours service response time, what is important to the customer is service resolution time, how long does it take to fix the machine so that it can be up and running, right? So, in these councils, we talk about the departmental CPIs. So every department sort of has a scorecard and say, okay, this is what success looks like if finance department is to be successful in the eyes of the customer. This is what it looks like for the services team, for our customers to be satisfied with our service level. Right? So sort of flip it around. So that's the CX Champion Council, right? That happens once a month, chaired by the CEO. And then at an operational level, we have what we call the Voice of the Customer Champions team. And again, we have representatives from different departments which comes together on a regular basis to discuss the operational issues and how we can respond, not as silo departments, right? But as a coherent organization. So, this has been put in practice for the last couple of years, and, it has served us well, especially during, the pandemic, starting out when, as Stacey was saying, it was organized chaos, right? That really helped us pivot and get us closer to the crux of customer satisfaction.
Great. Thank you, Susie. Does anyone else want to share some of their insights regarding shifting from a reactive to a proactive customer experience?
Yeah, I'll say that in my experience at Freshly, one thing that's been very useful for us is trying to get over one of the key barriers, which is trying to understand how can you experiment with different types of outreach strategies and not have to worry so much about cost or building infrastructure to support that when you're not sure what your ROI is. Because that's been a challenge in our case, where you have a lot of brilliant ideas about, you create an automated system to reach out to people at certain points and engage them. But then what happens if that doesn't work, and how can you pivot away from that? So one of the things that we found very useful, and we've actually done a lot more of it starting this year, and we're really heavily involved in it about a year and a half ago, even right before COVID, is using customer support agents as like a testing ground in order to be agile and scrappy in that area. So as an example, went through a period of time where we wanted to test out doing proactive SMS messages after customers signed up with us, but they hadn't downloaded our app in the process of signing up, knowing that customers who download our app are more likely to be loyal and more likely to engage with their subscription and more likely to enjoy their experience because of that. So we wanted to test out doing proactive messages, but in the normal circumstance, we have to wait for a short code to get set up in order to do that, and then you have to connect some internal system that can prompt the messages. And so normally that would have taken 2 months, 3 months, or 4 months. But what we do now is we have a core group of people within our customer support function whose responsibility is to test out different outreach strategies in a more manual way. Literally, we had this group of agents led by a manager go through a process of uploading lists. So they find a kind of an easy way to be able to send proactive messages to customers, not using short codes, and uploaded lists, and we're able to reach out. And then from that, we could track the rate of downloads of our app to see how successful that outreach was and what sort of response we received from customers. And then are able to pivot and say, yes, this is working. So now let's spend the time and the money to invest and officialize it through a short code or what have you. And that sort of strategy we use an awful lot in different ways, even when it comes to checking in with customers at certain parts of their order experience with a personalized message right after they order, or after they get their first delivery, or after they interact with our website in some form or fashion that indicates they may need assistance choosing their meals for next week or something. So the ability to be agile and to experiment and be scrappy and prove concepts before you jump full flung into it and invest money in it has been very useful in being able to keep us agile and keep people's ideas flowing so they don't reach a point where they just die on the vine because of lack of nutrients, so to speak.
Great, thank you. Stacey, I think that you were keen to share some thoughts here.
Yeah, I was, and it was just to add that I think that for in organizations where we see material progress made in that shift of getting to the proactive, they're those that have really a very transparent view and an absolutely a fearless commitment to the constant pursuit of what we often refer to as transferring failure demand into value demand. And typically across Australia and New Zealand, when we go in and do forensics activities, we very routinely find that 30% of the workload that exists in any organization doesn't necessarily need to exist. And it's, you know, it's just this constant demand of no particular value to the customer, and usually of great angst to every employee. And that can be quite confronting for many organizations. Not everybody's ready to face that, but those that have actually taken that big leap and leap of courage, and really seeing that as an invitation to reinvent, and get very interested in what they might do if they were able to free up that capacity. And I think in disruption, it's always going to ask us to do more with less. And I think we can suffer from this notion of cost out fatigue, and honing in on how you can actively create moments for customers that are meaningful, and that create a connection. I just think that's a far more energizing place to be. And it's where we can get deeply invested in making sure that people are connecting with customers and using the absolute limit of their skills and their capacity and their calling, if you like.
Fantastic. Some really brilliant insights there. Thank you. I'm going to finish up now with our last question. I might start with Jerry. And what I'd like to know is, what is the one thing that you could go back and do differently from 2020? What would that be?
I think fully embracing the work at home model is the one thing, right? What we've come to find out is because of the passion of our agents that the performance metrics have not gone down, have not suffered. Reimagining how these people can come together and collaborate as a team in virtual spaces is something that a lot of call centers doubt that you can do this, right? And they think that you have to have that supervisor oversight, constantly wearing down the agent on opportunities. But I think what we've all come to realize is that you don't have to have that. There's competitive juices on the agents, and they can collaborate virtually without being in person. So the one thing that for me is changing is that mindset of you have to be on site to be successful, and that's totally not true. And you can still get better performance from those people because you've now empowered them. You empowered those agents to deliver on the expectations.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. In my experience, we tend to get more out of our people when we trust them and empower and enable them to do their best. Thank you very much. Colin, what's the one thing that if you could go back and do differently, what would you change from last year?
Yeah, well, actually, I mean, I also will second what Jerry said, because I think that's a very profound statement that it is true that COVID has removed a lot of the scariness of work from home, where we also had a very sort of negative idea of, oh, we don't want to go in that direction, and it wouldn't work well for our particular use case. And now that we're in it and we've had to adapt and we've been in the situation to be more mindful about it, you do see what the benefits are from it. And it's definitely helped in some circumstances with morale. So as long as it's balanced out with having culture initiatives and you're on the ball with things, you can get the best of both worlds from that. So I agree that's very, very interesting. And that's one of the lessons that I also would take away. And the other lesson I would take away is just an appreciation for infrastructure that kind of goes alongside that. Because once you have people separated and you can't rely on casual conversations by the water cooler or something to communicate something, or just rely on the general office environment and the hum in the air to keep people focused. And you recognize how much that you really need to make sure is enshrined in some sort of process or some sort of procedure, not in like a crippling or a suffocating way, but how much you appreciate having things spelled out and having things organized as a way of getting everyone on the same page is really important. And so we've done a lot of that when it comes to buttoning up our policies and procedures with our partners abroad, our BPO partners and so forth. So I would put more emphasis on that and say that's one of the lessons that we've also taken out of COVID.
Great, thank you. Susie, what's the one thing that you would like to change, if you could, from 2020?
Can I offer two?
Sure.
So based on, I totally agree with what Jerry said in terms of embracing the work from home, right? And I think of it as from hardware to hardware. Hardware as in HARD to HEART, right? You know, from an organization perspective, you can provide the infrastructure, the access, the tools, and all that. But at the end of the day, we're basically saying that we have to trust our employees, right? They may not be in our physical side, but we trust that they will deliver on the outcomes that we've all, you know, collectively signed up for, right? So I think it's a long process in terms of building that trust, and it definitely needs, you know, to be part of the cultural shape. So that's one. The other thing that I think we should do more of, right, is that when you think about it today, omni-channel is how our customers and prospects and all that interact in the world today, right? But our contact center, it's, you know, to some extent traditionally still very much focused on the inbound, outbound. It could be, you know, web chats and calls and all that, right? But I think in the world that we live in today, social media is so critical, right? For us, we had the benefit of the call center and social media sort of coming under marketing, right? So we do have a centralized view. But I think traditionally many, you know, in many organizations, social media still sort of rolls up into corporate comms, for example, right? Whereas the call center, it's up, you know, operations perhaps, right? So I do think that increasingly there is a need, right, to think omni-channel and say, you know what, you know, our customers are actually using social media to reach out to us as well. And that must be one of the communication mixes when we look at, when we think about the future of call center or what it needs to be today.
Great, thank you. And Stacey, what's the one thing, if you could go back, that you'd do differently?
I think embracing the invitation for change faster. And what I mean by that is adopting the new ways of working as the new constant. If you're anything like me, you might have hung up on for a bit too long to the old ways of working and cling on to that notion that, oh, just until things get back to normal. And for me, that manifested as a period of mental and physical exhaustion, where we just changed in-office meetings to a marathon of virtual meetings. But this time you didn't even have a time in between meetings. You just go straight from one to the next. And it wasn't until we started more deliberately rebuilding and working to those new ways that we got to a more sustainable place. And we've had to put together, we've all been asked to do some extraordinary things and pull them off in a short space of time. And the fact that we had such a short space of time, I think, removed the fear. And getting into this kind of sprint-like mode and you know, agile, I think, is a very, very overused term, but it's really come into play here now where, you know, so much is possible in 2 weeks. And getting people energized by seeing progress, you know, testing it, learning from it, testing it with your customers, testing it with your employees, and really embracing the imperfection. Because I think if you look back at what we've actually achieved and the things that we achieved in such a short space of time, what I take from that is, you know, when you embrace the imperfection, good enough is actually really quite awesome in some spaces. And I think, you know, before we might have used that as a bit of a crutch. So I guess just embracing that a little bit quicker as to get to really the edge of our comfort zone into a whole new world.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all very much for your time today, and really great insights shared. So really thank you for being so generous with your time today. But that will bring to the end of today's panel. So for those of you in the US, I hope that you have a nice evening. Thank you, Susie, for joining us from Singapore. You've got an exciting day ahead, and certainly Stacey. So yeah, thank you everyone. Susie, Colin, Stacey, and Jerry for your time today. I hope you have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks.
Okay. I guess we're done.
All right.
We're done. All right then.
All right. Nice to meet you all.
Nice to meet you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.